My 380 SL is in the shop and I'm ready to begin my safety inspection. This is the first thing I do with a rolling restoration. You can see down here, I've already removed the exhaust system. I mean, that's really a safety issue, especially when you take a look at how bad this system is. So I'm going to replace that today. Before I ever drive the car again, then I'm going to go ahead and do the brake inspection. We'll pull the wheels off, look at the pads, rotors. And oh, by the way, I couldn't help myself. I had to get the buffer out. See that? And I had to buff the back of the trunk lid here. This is amazing. The paint really comes back to life. When it comes to a safety inspection, I believe there's nothing more important than checking the brakes first. Pretty much before you do anything else, particularly if the car is 25 years or older. I'll never forget the time my daughter Kai and I went down to Tacoma to pick up an old 1969 280 SE. And we just jumped in and started driving it back to Bellingham. And I looked out my rearview mirror after we had driven about 5 miles and I saw flames coming out of the front of the car. That's right. The brakes got so hot they caught the grease on fire in the ball joints. So I quickly became a believer in checking brakes on these old cars. So if you go out and acquire an old car, or you're going to buy one and drive it across country, don't do it unless you inspect the brakes yourself or have somebody do it. One of the quickest ways to do this, by the way, and I've shown this before in other videos, is you can jack the car up and you want to make sure that the calipers are not dragging. And the calipers could be dragging either because the pistons in the calipers are frozen or the rubber flexible brake hoses are swollen up and acting like a check valve. So you can do this yourself, but it's much easier to do it with a friend. So I have somebody up in the car, they're going to hit the brake, and before I do that, I'm just going to spin the wheel. Go ahead and take it out of gear. So what you want to do is you want to spin the wheel, and it should spin fairly freely. You might hear a little bit of dragging, a little bit of noise from the brake pad, but that's okay. Now I'm going to have the person inside the car push very hard on the brake, hard as you can. Okay, make sure it's locked up. Now release. Now when he releases that pedal, it should spin as freely as before he hit it. Okay, see that? See how easily that spins? So if you have a problem with your brakes, it's not going to spin that easily. It's going to drag, and in some cases it'll actually freeze up. So I'm going to go around and check all 4 brakes, then I'm going to go ahead and pull the tires off and do a visual inspection on the thickness of the pads. You got to check this out. We have probably rebuilt calipers, new rotors, and even brand new flexible brake hoses. Now this is a sign that the car has really been loved, particularly when you see someone replace the flexible brake hoses. I see a lot of calipers and rotors and pads get replaced, but this is the one that often gets forgotten. But I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, this isn't particularly cherry looking. I'm sorry, I can't live with this. I'm going to have to pull out the Zimmermann Z-coated rotors and put these on. We're going to pull the calipers back and paint the calipers. Man, that's stuck. You know, I told you I was impressed with the new parts put on Cherry here, but I think the mechanic missed one very important step, which I always recommend. We've got some seizure between this rear rotor and the hub, probably because no anti-seize was used. You can see a little rust there and a little rust on the centering pin here. So this isn't coming off. So what I do is I take a copper hammer so I don't damage the rotor, and I'm going to hit the rotor. And I'm going to hit it here. Okay, there, it's loose. All right, now we can pull it off. So you see what happens? That'll all rust inside there from the car sitting if you don't put a light film of anti-seize, particularly on this edge right here. I want to stick right on the centering edge. You can see the rotor is in excellent condition except for that rust. So this has probably been on the car a long time and the car's not been driven very much. So here we are, just a couple hours. I gotta say, this is the type of brake restoration work I like doing. Was it worth it? You know, I'm gonna let you be the judge. You know, I installed the new Zimmermann rotors. We took the calipers off and painted them with a engine high temperature paint, and I decided to install new pads. They looked okay, but you know, I didn't know the brand or the quality. They're not marked. They look like an inexpensive aftermarket pad. So I went ahead and put in Brembo Premium Ceramics. Look at the color match. Isn't that something? Now those are really cherry brake pads. And I even coated the flexible brake hose with 303 rubber protectant. So we've got these brakes restored, and I didn't have to take the car down for more than a day. And remember, you can thank Diego here for these amazing cherry brake pads. You know, if you're going to go on a long cross-country trip, be sure and paint your brake calipers. No, just kidding. But there is something I want to mention. I forgot to mention this earlier, and it's a real safety issue, and that is be sure and check the torque on your lug bolts or your wheel bolts before you head out on a long trip. You know, if these have been put on and over-torqued at some tire shop, you get out on the road with a flat, you can't even get the tire off. So anytime you're heading out for a long trip on a newly acquired car, make sure you go out and loosen up the lug bolts and then retorque them to the proper setting so you can get them off if you ever have to out on the open road. Well, just like the rears, the front brakes are all new also. Looks like the wheel bearings have been packed. You know, you want to check your wheel bearings as part of that safety inspection. You can do a preliminary check to see if there's any play, you know, in this front hub. But these look great. Now, of course, I am going to paint these calipers. Don't worry, they're going to get painted just like the rears. I don't think I'll change the rotors. I think I'll do a little paint work right in here and just leave them. But I do want to mention something. When I test drove the car, it pulled a little bit to the right, and I was concerned that there was a brake problem. And you can see why I'm so surprised pulling the wheels off and seeing all these new parts. But I'm never going to assume anything, and it's going to begin with these pads here. I want to inspect the front pads. I'm just going to pull them out and see what's going on. These pads are in there tight. Okay, here we go. All the edges are corroded and they're not sliding very well. You always want to make sure you put a little bit of brake pad grease right here on the edges so these will slide in and out. This has no anti-squeal shim plate on the back, and these appear to be very inexpensive aftermarket semi-metallic pads, so these are going to get replaced. Notice how this is glazed. See how glazed that is? That may be one of the reasons why I've got a little pull here. Maybe these pads didn't seat in properly. One of the reasons I like using the pads that we sell, they're scorched in, meaning they seat much better. So these are going to get replaced. See how this one looks. You can see how this radiator hose pick tool works really well for pulling out pads. Okay, it's going to be interesting to drive this car again after I get the new pads in and see if that eliminates the pull to the right side. You have to admit that looks better. Maybe now the car will go faster. Just kidding. I'm going to leave this rotor on there. This is what the Zimmerman rotor looks like. And you can imagine having all these vent holes down in here being plated. They're not going to rust. These are going to rust, but it's a lot of work to change a front rotor. I've got lots of projects to do today at the shop. So I'm going to leave this rotor on for the time being. I painted the caliper. I'll probably paint the hub of the rotor to minimize the rust. I'm not going to paint down in the cooling fins at all. But we're going to get the Brembo brake pads on there. And I want to talk a little bit more about these other pads I pulled off. Oh no, I dropped the pad. Shoot. Let me show you what Jerson made for me. You know, because I'm getting so old, he felt sorry for me having to, you know, like, oh, I got to bend over to get that pad. So I got a tool here you guys are going to really love. So check this out. We have a spring steel rod, a nice little handle, and on the end is one of our super strong rear end magnets. So I just carry this around the shop, seeing when I drop stuff on the floor, look at this, I just go down and go bang. I can pick up these heavy, even if I drop tools on the floor, look at that, I just drop a hammer and up she comes. Now, isn't that amazing? Thank you, Jerson. So take a look at the pad that we pulled out the front here. Notice it has no anti-squeal or anti-squeak shim pad on it. It's just steel backing, kind of a rough cast. And the mechanic that installed these pads, of course, he sprayed the brake stuff on the back side to prevent the squealing. But look, the piston just wears through that stuff and hits metal on metal. And it's metal on metal which is going to cause that squealing when you hit the brakes at slow speed. And you can usually tell quality pads because they have these shim plates that have kind of a plasticized coating on them to really prevent squealing. And of course, Brembo really upped the game with the design of their brake pads. Look at the backing on these. Now, I guarantee you're not going to get any squealing on these pads. So I have a hunch that I'm going to notice a difference when we get the new Brembo pads in and take this out on the road. A lot of times these cheap pads, you just kind of lose that nice Mercedes brake pedal feedback when you do heavy braking. So I recommend you just don't buy cheap pads. And of course, we'll report back to Diego how well these new pads perform. Well, that completes the rolling restoration of the brake system on my 380 SL. You'll have to admit that was kind of a piece of cake, all right? And I know a lot of these R107s out there aren't going to be like this when you get them as far as the brake system. And this is a really good illustration, by the way. Let's say you bought one of these, supposed to be in pristine condition. You got all these maintenance records that said the whole brake system has been overhauled. You think, oh, I'm good, you know, no problem. Well, you just saw that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes things are not done properly, and other times inferior parts are used. And I think those brake pads on my 380 SL were causing some brake issues. It just did not feel like Mercedes brakes when I drove this car. And you're going to say, well, you know, how much would this cost? You could be into this for $1,000 to $1,500 if you took it into a shop. So, you know, if you're going to own one of these cars, I keep trying to encourage people, you know, learn how to work on it yourself. If not, at least get educated as to what the problems are so you can go into any types of repairs with your eyes open. Now, a number of years ago, I wrote a complete brake systems overhaul manual. So if you want to try to tackle some of these brake jobs on your own R107, I recommend you get my manual. It covers all kinds of things, including, you know, common signs of problems, component inspection. I go over brake pad replacement, flexible brake hose replacement. I go over brake master cylinder replacement and the brake caliper and rotor replacement. And I even cover replacing the emergency brake shoes in these older Mercedes-Benzes. You actually might be encouraged to say, look, I could do some of this work, particularly something like the emergency brakes, which are always bad on these old R107s. So I hope in your quest to find a nice R107 or in your current efforts to restore your own, I hope your brake system is not too bad.